very sad that none of the women in our congregation can be with us this evening for lots of different reasons, for holidays, for ill health, and visiting other family members. I know where they all are. They're all okay, except Wendy and Tara, who are really quite unwell. But on the other hand, it was like male voice choir. It was really sweet. Would you pray with me, please? Holy and loving God, for the extraordinary gift that you give us of a voice, we thank you and praise you. We thank you for music, the way it fills our hearts and draws us into your presence. And the way that you draw us forward, the way that you bring us into your life and your light and your grace, we thank you and praise you. And ask right now that you just reach out with your hand and you touch us, that you may be a word in us. Come to us, reveal your glory to us afresh. We ask in Jesus' name. Amen. Amen. So I do feel like singing happy birthday, because did you know that today is the birthday of Charles Darwin? And he's 208. Well, he would be if he'd kind of, managed it out. But unfortunately, he passed away a long time ago. But had he lived, today would have been his 208th birthday. So today is called Evolution Sunday. And some 1,780 churches around the world have signed up to what's called the Clergy Letter Project. And we are one of them, just in case you didn't know. And effectively what they say is, and what the Clergy Letter says, is that there is space for both science and religion in the world, and they don't need to fight one another. But did you know that Charles Darwin was not the first person to propose that life evolves? Actually, the idea started 2,500 years ago with a guy called Empedocles. And he gave the idea that life evolves into higher forms. And then about 200 years later, a guy called Anaximander, I'm probably not saying that right, he taught that all life sprang from the seas and evolved into present-day forms. And in fact, up until the 1700s, it was a widely accepted academic view. And it ended up being rejected because it wasn't scientific. And then along came Charles Darwin, and he offered the first proof that evolution was an order in creation. Now, I know that evolution is just a theory, but in reality, all scientific work is just theory. Because the thing about theory is that you can't prove it, you can only disprove it. The theory of gravity, for example, is still a theory on which people are working on how it works, and I suppose until we all go flying off into space, it'll kind of remain a theory. And in the same way, just as we happily trust that our feet will kind of stay attached to the skin of this planet, we use modern evolutionary theory when predicting things like mutation of viruses and extinction rates of various animals as the climate changes. So we have evolutionary models which we then use. Now, I'm always surprised at those folks who believe that religion that there is the Bible and science, and the twain shall meet. Because I think in reality they're just kind of radio stations on different wavelengths playing very different music. They're both valid, they're just very, very different. I think the problem starts when we start to think about religion in the same way that we think about science. Because in science everything is proven or disproven. And if we look at the Bible in that light, and we think of it as a book that people could either prove or disprove, then it becomes a book of facts, lots of which don't actually stand up to the kind of scrutiny that science would use. It also means the Bible then becomes a textbook rather than a library of various literary works that are all very, very different and I believe inspired of God. Now, I know over the years many people have become disenchanted with the church. And yet, at the same time, there seems to be an even greater interest in spirituality. Have you ever wondered why that is? Well, I think that for many churches, people think that the church has just lost its place in the world. You know, traditionally, the church has been built on three foundations: on the Bible, tradition, and experience. And, well, that's the theory anyway. In reality, we have the Bible and tradition, but when I was young, because my experience was different, then it was discounted. And I think that happens a lot in various churches. So how many years did the church state that LGBT people chose to be that way because most of the stories in the Bible are heterosexual? LGBT people stepped forward and said, excuse me, but our experience is that our sexuality and gender is a part of who we are and always has been. We were born this way, to quote Saint Gaga. But the church said, no, you're wrong. Excuse me, wrong about who I am, wrong about my experience. I mean, you're having a laugh, right? The Bible's only heterosexual because you choose to read it that way, just as much as it's patriarchal and misogynistic because you're mostly patriarchal and misogynistic. When we let the Bible speak for itself, we find that there's lots of stuff in value for all of us. For example, there are gay love stories like the story of David and Jonathan, lesbian love stories like the story of Ruth and Naomi. Now, you don't have to read the stories that way, but they're just as valid if you do. And I think quite often we do the same thing with Jesus and his teachings, because it's very easy to read everything through a single lens. You know, everything, for example, becomes about the next world. It becomes about heaven and hell, because that's maybe the way that the church played it up. I was brought up Jehovah's Witness, so that was a very specific lens through which everything was read, and everything was seen in that light. I think that if you let Jesus speak for himself, then quite often you find that something very different is being said. So if we look at our Bible reading tonight, which I think is probably one of the most misused pieces of scripture in the Bible, it says, Jesus said, "You've heard it said of those of ancient times, you shall not murder, and whoever murders shall be liable to judgment. But I say to you that if you're angry with a brother or sister, then you'll be liable to judgment. And if you insult a brother and sister, you'll be liable to the council. And if you say, you fool, you'll be liable to the fire of hell, or the hell of fire." So the first bit kind of makes sense. If you're angry with a brother or sister, you're liable to judgment. That's the way families work. We've all got families, we know how that happens. If you insult a brother or sister, you'll be liable to the council. Well, in Jesus' day, if you insulted a brother or sister and there was a real family rift, then the local council of elders would be brought in to sort things out. So that makes absolute sense. But what about the hell of fire? Is he saying that if you call someone an idiot, then you go to hell? Or is he saying that if you can't allow others to make mistakes, then you won't be able to allow yourself to make mistakes either? And since we all make mistakes every single day, then if you don't believe that you should be making mistakes, you're going to be forever torturing yourself for doing so. And that's hell. He says, "You've heard it said, you shall not commit adultery. But I say to you that anyone who looks at someone with lust has already committed adultery with them in their heart. If your right eye causes you to sin, tear it out and throw it away. It's better for you to lose one of your members than for your whole body to be thrown into hell. And if your right hand causes you to sin, cut it off and throw it away. Better for you to lose one of your members than your whole body to go into hell." So is he saying we should poke out our eyes and cut off our hands? Well, people have done exactly that. And I don't believe for a minute that that's actually what he was saying. Imagine this. Imagine Jesus is sat with a group of people talking about sin. And when I say people, I mean men. And when I say men, I mean straight men. So the men talk about women. How could God expect us to control ourselves when women are so attractive? Especially the foreign women. They wear such revealing clothing. The Roman girls, they wear materials bought from the East that cling to the figure. Some wear sheer fabrics, so when they're dancing for coins, you catch a glimpse of a breast. They're in the street, you can't help but see them. No wonder men stop and watch. The men say to Jesus, "Can you blame us for looking at them when they dress like that? Our wives don't dress like that, and even in the bedroom they don't look like that. Can you blame us if we lust after them? It's their fault, not ours." And Jesus says, "No, it's not the women that's at fault. It's you who's at fault. Stop looking at women that way. The women you see, regardless of how they dress, are mothers and daughters and wives and widows, all struggling to survive in the world the best way they can. Look with the heart, not with your libido. See them as people, not as objects to be used. And if you can't keep your hands to yourself, that's nobody's problem except yours. If you grope someone without consent in a crowd or in the dark, you're to blame, no one else, certainly not them. You dare to blame them for your lust. You dare to suggest that you have no control because you're just a man. Go to Rome. Put your hand in the mouth of truth and see if it doesn't take your hand off. If it's your heart that needs fixing, not the women on the streets. Not your wives, your heart." But of course the men didn't understand. Perhaps they didn't want to, or they were so used to being the ones with all the power, they didn't feel like they had to. "What do you expect us to do?" they say. "Pluck our eyes out? Chop our hands off?" Jesus says, God expects you to take responsibility for your own lives, your own actions, and respect others. Did you get a chance to see the video clip that I sent out?
Yeah.
The stone face that Audrey Hepburn and Gregory Peck put their hands into is called the Mouth of Truth. And it's in Rome. It's now outside a church. And in the film, of course, they make a big play of putting their hand in and losing their hand. Now, it was around in Jesus' day, it was at the entrance to one of the temples in Rome. And there was a legend, of course, that if you put your hand in the mouth and told a lie, that it would take your hand off. And it all started because the rumour was the wife of a rich noble was accused of having an affair. And so she was taken to this so she could put her hand into the mouth and say, "I have not had an affair." And of course, if she was innocent, it would leave it alone. And if she was guilty, it would take the hand off. But she was very, very clever. And what she did was she planted her lover in the crowd. And just as she was about to put her hand into the mouth, the lover ran forward, pretending to be a madman, picked her up, hugged her, and kissed her, and then went, let her go, and ran away. So she was able to put her hand in his mouth and say, "I've never been kissed by anybody except my husband." "Oh, that madman." And that's how she got away with it. And that was the legend. So Jesus is telling it as it is, but I think he's also using imagery and he's using local legends that his listeners will understand. He's not saying, these things are wrong because God will be upset. He's saying these things are wrong because they damage people, because they inevitably damage you. He's saying, you and I know it's not anybody's fault but yours. And you wouldn't dare say that women are to blame and put your hand into the mouth of truth, because you just lose your hand. It would just chop it off. Now, if we understand that the Bible isn't written as a book of facts, but a book that's full of stories and lessons that have many different layers and many different ways to interpret them, then we're able to find ourselves in its pages and understand the world better. The Bible can be a book that helps us to connect with reality rather than walling us off from it. Choosing between science and the Bible is a little bit like choosing between a loaf of bread and a pair of socks. They're both completely different things. In the real world, they both have their own place, serving very different needs. I think that if we're to be a church that's relevant, then we also need to be a church that deals with reality. The church should be based on scripture, tradition, and experience, all three. And experience tells us that God makes gay, lesbian, bisexual, transgendered people, in fact, all kinds of people. Experience tells us that evolution is a scientific principle that's used to predict everything from the path of a disease to the impact of environmental changes on species. Experience tells us that both the Bible and science are invaluable in our lives. And if Charles Darwin was alive now, I think he'd be saying the same thing. After all, it is exactly what he said almost 200 years ago. Charles Darwin was a Christian man who saw the wonder of God in creation and marveled at the way in which creation sang God's praises. I feel exactly the same way. Amen.
Amen.